Welcome to today's story. Cowboy paid $12 for a horse, got the chief's 2 daughters instead. It's a wild Western tale full of humor, fate, and unexpected love. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Let's get started. The sun blazed over the small frontier town of Redstone, Wyoming, in the summer of 1885. Dust rose from the dry earth as the wind carried the scent of hay, sweat, and gunpowder through the streets. A lone cowboy named Jack Dalton rode in slowly, his hat tilted forward and his boots coated with the dust of 100 miles. He had been traveling for days, his saddle worn, his pockets nearly empty, and his hopes set on one goal: to buy himself a horse, a real one, sturdy enough to start his life anew in the American West. Jack had worked on cattle drives since he was 15, toughened by endless days under the burning sun and nights beside campfires that flickered against the open prairie. He had saved every coin he could, sleeping in barns and taking whatever work came his way, wrangling strays, fixing fences, even hauling lumber for the local rail crew. $12 didn't seem like much to most men, but for Jack, it was the sum of years of sweat and stubborn hope. He was determined to turn those $12 into something that would carry him toward freedom. As he rode into the heart of Redstone, the town buzzed with Saturday energy. The blacksmith's hammer clanged from the forge, children ran barefoot through the dusty street, and the saloon doors swung constantly as men sought shade and whiskey. Jack tied his mule outside the general store and glanced toward the trading post nearby. There, tied to a post in the sun, stood a magnificent brown stallion with a white blaze down its nose, strong, calm, and proud. Jack's eyes lit up. That was the horse he had been waiting for. Inside the trading post, a tall, weathered man sat behind a table covered in beaded trinkets and hand-carved pipes. He wore a long feathered band and a vest of soft leather. Chief Running Bear, known around the territory as a fair trader and a man of few words. Beside him stood his 2 daughters, Lila and Sana, both quiet but observant, their eyes following every stranger who entered. Jack took off his hat respectfully, trying not to look too eager. "Sir," he began in a polite drawl, "I saw that fine stallion tied outside. I'd like to buy him. I can pay $12 cash." The chief studied him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he said in slow, deliberate English, "$12 for trade. You pay, you take." His daughters exchanged brief glances but said nothing. Jack, thinking the deal was made, smiled and reached into his coat. He counted the bills carefully, 10, 11, 12, and laid them on the table. The chief nodded once, then extended his hand. Jack shook it firmly, sealing what he thought was the simplest bargain of his life. With a grin, he tipped his hat again and said, "Pleasure doing business, Chief." When Jack stepped outside, he untied the stallion and gave it a gentle pat on the neck. The animal responded calmly, as if already recognizing him. He mounted up and rode around the town once, feeling taller than he had in years. Finally, he had his own horse, his ticket to freedom, work, and a future that didn't rely on anyone else. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Jack stopped at the edge of town to water his horse by the creek. He hummed a tune, completely unaware that his deal had been misunderstood. Or perhaps understood a little too well. Just as the stars began to appear, he heard soft footsteps behind him. When he turned around, he saw the chief's daughters approaching, each carrying a bundle of blankets, pots, and jewelry. Lila, the older one, smiled shyly. "Father say, we go with you now," she said softly. Jack blinked, confused. "Go with me?" No, you must be mistaken. I paid for the horse." Sana, the younger sister, shook her head and replied, "You pay $12. You pay for family. We belong to you now." Jack's mouth fell open, his hat nearly slipping off. "Now hold on. I never said nothing about—" Before he could finish, Chief Running Bear appeared at the top of the hill, watching from afar with a calm expression. He raised his hand in farewell. The 2 girls looked at him once more, then back at Jack, waiting for his word. The cowboy scratched his head, utterly lost. The situation was absurd. He'd come to buy a horse, not 2 brides. But there they stood, ready to follow him wherever he went, their eyes trusting, their hands holding everything they owned. The horse snorted as if mocking his confusion. Jack tried to reason with them, explaining over and over that there had been a mistake, that he had meant to buy the stallion, not anyone's daughters. But every time he spoke, Lila just nodded politely and said, "Yes, you good man. Father choose you." By now, a small crowd had gathered near the saloon, watching with amusement. The townsfolk whispered and chuckled, and one man shouted, "Hey, Dalton, you sure got your money's worth." The laughter rolled down the street like thunder, and Jack felt his face burn red under the brim of his hat. By sunset, Jack realized there was no easy way out. Returning the girls would mean insulting the chief, a dangerous mistake in those parts. Keeping them meant living with the strangest bargain ever made west of the Mississippi. The two women followed him without complaint, helping pack his saddle and leading the horse as if it was the most natural thing in the world. When Jack finally mounted up to leave, they climbed onto a small wagon behind him, smiling quietly. The whole town waved, shouting jokes that echoed long after he disappeared down the dusty trail. As the night grew colder, Jack made camp near the Sweetwater River, trying to process what had just happened. The chief's daughters sat by the fire, cooking stew and humming softly, completely at ease. Jack stared into the flames, muttering to himself, $12 for a horse, and I end up with a family. The absurdity made him chuckle despite himself. Somewhere between the laughter and the crackle of the fire, he realized that the West had its own way of teaching lessons, some that came cheap and others that cost far more than gold. For weeks after that strange day, Jack Dalton rode through Wyoming's endless plains with the two sisters following close behind. They said little, but their presence was constant, quiet, graceful, and surprisingly helpful. Lila gathered herbs and cooked hearty meals, while Sana handled the horses with a natural calm that impressed Jack more than he cared to admit. At first, he tried dropping them off at nearby settlements, hoping they'd choose to stay behind, but they always found their way back before dawn. Eventually, he stopped trying. Somehow, his $12 bargain had become a partnership he couldn't quite escape. When they reached the foothills near Sweetwater, Jack built a rough cabin using timber from fallen pines. It wasn't much, just a single room with a stove, a bunk, and enough space for 3 souls who had nowhere else to go. Leela and Sana made it a home. They stitched curtains from old blankets, painted beads on the doorway, and tamed the wild patch of land beside the river. Within weeks, they had a small garden growing beans and corn, and the cabin no longer looked like a wanderer's shelter but like something permanent, something alive. Word of the cowboy with 2 wives spread fast across the county. Every traveler who stopped in Redstone heard the tale, and every version grew taller than the last. Some said Jack won them in a poker game. Others swore he'd stolen them from the chief and was now hiding out in the hills. The truth was stranger and simpler. He'd just been too polite to argue. When ranch hands or traders passed by and teased him about it, Jack only smiled wryly and said, "Best horse trade I ever made." Deep down, though, he wondered what the chief had really meant that day. The 2 sisters were different as daylight and dusk. Lila was thoughtful and calm, the kind who could silence an argument with a single glance. Sana, younger and restless, loved to ride the open prairie, racing the wind until her laughter echoed across the fields. Jack found himself learning from both of them, patience from Lila, courage from Sana. Together they turned survival into something close to peace. On long nights by the fire, they told stories of their people, of spirits in the mountains and rivers that never stopped singing. Jack listened, half skeptical, half enchanted. One stormy evening, lightning split the horizon as rain poured down on their cabin. Jack had gone out to secure the horses when he slipped on the muddy bank and felt a sharp sting in his leg, a rattlesnake bite. He fell hard, dizzy and weak. Within seconds, Leela and Sana were at his side. Lila cut the wound with a sharp knife and sucked the poison out without hesitation while Sana crushed leaves into a paste and bound the wound tight. Jack drifted in and out of consciousness that night, hearing their voices through the storm, steady and fearless. They saved his life. When he awoke days later, the storm had passed. The air smelled clean and the world outside glistened under sunlight. Lila sat beside him, grinding herbs in a bowl, while Sana fed the fire. Jack stared at them with a strange warmth in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt something beyond survival, belonging. They hadn't asked for payment or thanks. They'd simply chosen to care. He realized then that somewhere between confusion and laughter, the bargain had turned into something real. $12 had bought him more than he ever intended, a home, loyalty, and love in its quietest form. Seasons changed and the small homestead grew. Jack raised horses for nearby ranches, and Lila traded beads and blankets in Redstone. Sana rode into town once a week with him, her hair whipping in the wind, fearless as ever. People still whispered when they saw them, but no one mocked him anymore. The legend of the $12 cowboy had turned into a story folks told with a grin, half joke, half respect. Jack had built a life no man could have planned, and every time he looked at the two women beside him, he knew fate had a wild sense of humor. Years rolled by like the river beside their cabin. Jack's hair turned gray and lines marked his weathered face. Lila's eyes stayed calm as ever, while Sana's laughter still carried across the hills. Their children grew strong and proud, learning both the ways of the plains and the traditions of their mother's people. Jack often sat by the fire at night, pipe in hand, remembering the day he walked into Redstone with $12 in his pocket. It seemed like a lifetime ago, a foolish bargain that had somehow turned into the best decision he'd ever made. In his final years, when travelers passed by and asked about the old story, Jack would smile under his hat and say, "Boys, sometimes you go looking for a horse and end up finding your whole life instead." The tale spread across Wyoming and beyond, not as a warning, but as a reminder of the strange way destiny works in the Wild West. Some said the chief had seen something in Jack that day, something worth trusting with his daughters. Others believed it was pure luck. Jack never argued either way. He just smiled, the way a man smiles when he's made peace with his past. When Jack Dalton finally passed, the chief's daughters buried him on the hill overlooking the Sweetwater River, beneath a lone pine tree that caught the morning sun. They placed his old saddle beside the grave and whispered a prayer in their native tongue. Down in Redstone, the townsfolk still told the story of the cowboy who paid $12 for a horse and got the chief's two daughters instead. But those who knew the truth understood it wasn't about a bargain. It was about the wild, unpredictable heart of the American frontier, where even the strangest deals could lead to love.